And we are back with another episode of the Kyle Anslone Show. Very excited for everything I have today. A lot of news that has me fired up. So I want to roll into it pretty quickly here. If you are listening live, take a second to like and share the show. That is how we get out there to more viewers. We are a growing channel, but channels only grow with your support. And with that, on today's list, we have Venezuelan boat strikes, getting into that. Putin and Wickoff talks, I'll break that down, and what I think is kind of the future for Ukraine there. And Israel's next step in ethnically cleansing Gaza and the latest updates on the ceasefire talks. So starting off here with Venezuela, we talked about this on a little bit at the end of the last show with Harrison Berger, that this story in the Washington Post came out that the September 2nd strike on a drug boat, this is the boat that was carrying 11 people. Actually, the very first strike on the drug boat that was carried out, it was in the Caribbean. There were actually initially 2 survivors of that strike. And then either Pete Hegseth gave the direct order to fire a second missile, or the commander acting on Pete Hegseth's previous orders to kill everybody ordered the firing of a second missile that killed the 2 survivors. And so I have a clip here of Trump and Hegseth discussing it, and then I'll get into my analysis.
Sunk the boat and eliminated the threat. And it was the right call. We have his back.
I watched it live. We knew exactly who was in that boat. We knew exactly what they were doing. Those 11 drug traffickers are no longer with us, sending a very clear signal that this is an activity the United States is not going to tolerate. It won't stop with just this strike. Anyone else trafficking in those waters who we know is a designated narco-terrorist will face the same fate. What we have there in the Caribbean is a clear demonstration of military might.
I watched that first strike live. As you can imagine, at the Department of War, we got a lot of things to do. So I didn't stick around for the hour and 2 hours, whatever, where all the sensitive site exploitation digitally occurs. So I moved on to my next meeting. I did not personally see survivors, but I stand, because the thing was on fire. It was exploded and fire and smoke. You can't see anything. You got digital. This is called the fog of war.
We'll look into it. But no, I wouldn't have wanted that, not a second strike. The first strike was very lethal. It was fine. And if there were 2 people around, but Pete said that didn't happen.
I still haven't gotten a lot of information because I rely on Pete. But to me, it was an attack. It wasn't 1 strike, 2 strikes, 3 strikes. Somebody asked me a question about the second strike. I didn't know about the second strike. I didn't know anything about people. I wasn't involved in it. I knew they took out a boat.
So this is all just so clearly absurd what happened here. Now, some people have pointed out, and I think fairly so, that this particular strike, because 24 boats have been destroyed, 80 people have been killed. And so this is only 2 people that were killed. This was only one of the strikes, and that all the strikes are war crimes. All the strikes are extrajudicial killings. All the strikes are unconstitutional. All the strikes are illegal. And that is absolutely true. But I think it is worth really focusing down on this one because of how indisputable it is that this is a war crime, that this was murder, that Pete Hegseth endorsing this effectively makes him the secretary of murder. So, you know, whenever the first strike hit that drug boat, obviously the drugs, if there are any on board, if it was even a drug boat, was taken out. The 2 survivors are clinging to the wreckage of their vessel. They have no method to get to the United States of America. They're clearly not armed or in any way present a threat to anyone, right? They're vulnerable to the Caribbean Sea at that point. The waters, if you just leave them drift out there for a few more hours, they're probably not going to make it anyways. And yet they order the second strike and murder them in the water rather than sending rescue boats. And I think for everyone, this is just so clearly murder, right? Where, you know, Pete Hegseth will claim, oh, they're narco terrorists, they're trafficking fentanyl to the United States, they're killing Americans. And a lot of people will accept that as true. And then they will say, well, with that, we understand how the Trump administration could then argue that this is protecting the United States of America. Obviously, I don't agree with that, but there are a lot of people who, not a lot, there are some Americans who vocalize that opinion, and a lot of them are in Washington. And I think that is, at least to people, sounds like a rational thought process. But whenever you're blowing up the survivors, whenever you're killing people who, you claim at one point that they were combatants, but now, clearly they're not. They're effectively wounded and in the waters, right? They've been neutralized. They're effectively surrendered, right? So like killing them is no different than when a week ago we saw the Israelis have a couple Palestinians show that they were disarmed. They pulled up their shirts to show they didn't have any bombs or anything like that. And then they had a march back into a building where they shot and killed them. And this is effectively the same thing, except it happened with probably a $200,000 missile rather than a couple of bullets. And this is just so clearly, indisputably a war crime. There's a fantastic article, Daniel McCarthy at, it's a conservative outlet. I forget the name of it. Where he writes and he's like, even if you could make arguments for all the other strikes, there's no way that you can make an argument for this strike. And so I think that is a really big deal, because whenever you're trying to win the battle in public opinion, whenever you're trying to convince the American people that this is a bad policy, that this is wrong, that this needs to stop, that Congress needs to rein the president in, the more clear that argument is, the better it is, and the shorter that you can make it. And this is just a very clear, concise argument that anyone can make against the strikes on drug boats in the Caribbean, and that Hegseth is now a criminal, right? Like, he should face charges. He should face murder charges for this, as well as, potentially other people who gave the order and carried out the order. This is a really big deal. Now, also, I find this interesting, how it maybe ties in with something we had talked about on the show last week, and that was the Pentagon going after Senator Mark Kelly, and the video of Mark Kelly and other members of Congress, Democrats, telling troops not to follow unlawful orders. And I do really wonder if Kelly and the others knew about the Washington Post story that was about to break, knew about Hegseth's order to kill everyone, and that's why they delivered the message. I also find the Pentagon reaction to open an investigation into Senator Kelly as a real effort to silence, because they are probably very concerned about this in the Pentagon. And I think we probably have seen a change of policy away from these follow-on strikes. That's why in other strikes where there were survivors, they were rescued. One of them was returned to Ecuador, where he was released as an innocent man. So, these people probably aren't criminals anyways. Again, every single strike is murder, right? But in this one particular case is so clear. And the fact that they had to then change the policy not to conduct these follow-on strikes is almost an admission within the government. Now, while we're talking about the Caribbean, I do want to say I am getting very concerned that we're about to start land strikes inside of Venezuela. Now, where those strikes will start, whether it's strikes against alleged cartels, maybe they're in areas of Venezuela that are fairly remote. There's a lot of rainforest. There's a lot of, I think, kind of swampland in Venezuela where there's not very many people living. Maybe they start with that. Or maybe we see something like with Iran, where Trump just immediately goes for the knockout blow. They attempted decapitation strike in Caracas, or bomb several Venezuelan military targets, and effectively tell Maduro that your military has been neutralized and now you must capitulate, surrender, and flee the country. I am very, very concerned that we are going to see land strikes in Venezuela by the time we get to Christmas here. This seems to be building. Donald Trump has set absolutely unreasonable expectations for Maduro. The idea that the Venezuelan leader is just going to hop on a plane with his wife and child and flee the country at the order of the president of the United States of America is completely absurd. And let's not just go past all this without forgetting and not mentioning that none of this is necessary, right? Maduro is willing to have another round of elections. And I think he's even said he's willing to not run in those elections. He'll have his vice president run. And even if he is effectively, a proxy for Maduro, still, this is a pretty major concession. Trump could paint it as a victory. Other issues here, the idea that Maduro is an illegitimate leader just doesn't seem to be true. I mean, look, he's been in charge of the country for almost, I think, a decade and a half now. And so certainly the state institutions do work in his favor, but that doesn't mean that he has to rig the elections to win. Same thing with Vladimir Putin. He has a lot of control. He cracks down on the population, sure, but he wins elections by an overwhelming majority. And that does, in some cases, reflect what the Russian people think. Just because somebody is oppressive, a communist, a dictator, or something like that, doesn't mean they also don't have a majority support of their people. And look, we partner with countries all the times that have leaders that really shouldn't be in charge, like the Saudi kingdom or the sheiks in the Emirates, right? Like we are able to deal with these other leaders, even though they are not elected. I think the biggest scam, of course, is around the fentanyl, this idea that Maduro is a narco trafficker. This is the same playbook they rolled out against Gaddafi and Saddam and Assad. They make all these false claims about how they're really bad guys and it would be a really good thing if we took them out. And again, those people are bad guys. They did do bad things, not the things that we claim that they did, because the American people, they don't care that Assad is locking political prisoners up in his dungeons. I mean, they would prefer that he not do it, but there's no way they would want to send their tax dollars, their children to Syria to go overthrow Bashar al-Assad. Saddam was horrific to his people, tortured, murdered tens of thousands of them. The American people, they're not going to fight a war for that. They will if you lie and you tell them that Saddam is developing nuclear weapons, or that Gaddafi is on his way to commit a genocide against all the men, women, and children in Benghazi or something like that. But short of those major lies, the American people aren't interested in the war. And this major lie is about the fentanyl, saying that, oh, the drugs that are killing Americans are coming here from Venezuela. And that's simply not true. There is some cocaine trafficking that goes through Venezuela. If you look at reports of where the cocaine that comes into the United States comes from, it comes from the Pacific coast of South America, Peru, Ecuador, Colombia. And then, a lot of the fentanyl is actually then mixed in Mexico. It doesn't even come, directly from those other countries. But none of the fentanyl, a small amount of cocaine, is all that's coming from Venezuela. And then they had to create this even larger lie that it's not just that the drugs that don't exist are coming from Venezuela, but those drugs are being directed by Maduro, by the president of Venezuela. And again, there's just simply no evidence for this. The cartel TDA, even the U.S. intelligence community has said that Maduro's not a part of that. Cartel of the Suns was invented by the CIA and simply no longer exists. And so in these two cases, there's just no ties that Maduro is doing anything to harm Americans anywhere. In fact, he's willing to step aside or hold new elections. He's willing to let America exploit Venezuela's natural resources. And he is currently taking deportation flights from the United States. And so, if Maduro had gone to his advisors before Donald Trump came into office and was asking them how he would do a good job of relating to Donald Trump and not having Donald Trump conduct another coup attempt in Venezuela, I think what they would have told him is accept the migrants, crack down on the drugs, which the Venezuelans are doing, hold elections, and just go about your business. Allow the Americans to do business in Venezuela. Allow them to pump and have access to the oil. And even though Venezuela has done all that, they're still pushing for war. And I think the dynamic really all centers around Marco Rubio. As I've been saying the entire time that we've been doing this show, essentially, right after Trump came into office, or probably even before when they first announced that Rubio was going to be the Secretary of State, I said there's a real chance that we could end up in a major military confrontation in Latin America if Marco Rubio ends up having influence in Latin America. And to my absolute horror, rather than Marco Rubio, being completely sidelined and maybe just allowing to have access to the Latin America file, he's become Trump's top national security consultant. This is his national security advisor, his secretary of state. This man has a lot of power, sway, and influence over what the U.S. government is doing. I mean, he essentially ripped up Trump's initial 28-point peace plan for Ukraine and replaced it with the 19.1 after talking with the Ukrainians. And so he has a lot of power. He has a lot of influence. He wants regime change in Venezuela. And, as absurd as this is going to sound, I do think it's the case that this really isn't even about Maduro or Venezuela. This is about Cuba. And there's this Republican contingent from South Florida that believes, I don't know, I can't even assess how true this is, but basically, since the fall of the Soviet Union, really what has kept the communist government in Cuba propped up has been the communist government in Venezuela. So that would have been Chavez and now Maduro. And so they believe if they get rid of Maduro, then they could get the regime change that they really want, which is the one in Cuba. So I think this is Marco Rubio's whole play here. And if we do end up with a smoldering pile of ruins in Venezuela, not only are we going to have to deal with the fallout from that, but we're going to have to deal with new regime change advocates from the HOTS, the Latin America HOTS. Leading the charge would be Marco Rubio, of course. All right. So I want to update this story and then essentially everything going on with the Ukraine war here. This is Putin discussing the situation in Ukraine ahead of talks with Steve Witkoff.
Last time, you mentioned, and I asked then, on the left bank of the Oskol River, can the enemy not escape south along the bank?
Oh, he cannot. Because south of this encircled enemy grouping, there is dense defense by the 1st Tank Army along the entire left bank. The defense is some 17 kilometers southward. An offensive is also developing on the Rubsovsk and Krasnoarmeysk directions of the western group. The assault units of the western group of forces have entered Krasnoliman and are currently fighting in the southeastern and eastern parts of the city. Street fighting continues in Drobyshevo and Yerevan. This is in the Krasnoliman direction. The southern group of forces advances in the northern part of the Donetsk People's Republic. In the Seversk direction, active combat operations have liberated the localities of Zvanovka, Vashukovka, and Petrovsko. In Seversk itself, assault units of the Third Army are engaged in street battles and are expanding control zones in the northeast and southern areas of the city, liberating over 100 buildings daily. In the Kramatorsk-Druzhovka direction, the southern group, the localities of Ivanopol have been liberated, and street battles continue in Konstantinovka. The southeastern and eastern parts of the city of Konstantinovka have come under our control, encompassing more than 30% of the total number of buildings in Konstantinovka. The center group liberated the city of Krasnoarmeysk and continues to eliminate enemy units in Dmitrov. Additionally, part of the grouping's forces is successfully advancing into the Dnipropetrovsk region. The eastern group of forces continues to advance at a fast pace in the western direction, expanding the control zone in the Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporozhye regions. The Dnieper group of forces troops are advancing in the Zaporozhye direction, having encircled the locality of Stepnogorsk. Fighting is ongoing to seize Primorsk. In addition, the General Staff's plan continues with the retaliatory mass strikes on Ukraine's military-industrial facilities and energy infrastructure supporting them.
So this is, I think, really important that Russia made this statement in the lead up between the talks between Putin and Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff. I believe Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, also attended those meetings. Basically what the Russians are laying out, and I look at the South Front maps every day. I don't just go off the Russian battlefield reports, but if you look at what's happening, particularly in the Donbass right now, the Russians have made some really significant gains, and essentially the Ukrainians have lost the most crucial city that they still held on to in the Donbass, Provosk. And with Russia taking that city and now having its sister city encircled entirely, there isn't much left significant of the Donbass for Russia to take. And there's also a lot of flat land out there. So it's not places that's going to be easy for the Ukrainians to defend. When you're in a city, you could hunker down in buildings, you could engage in street to street fighting, you could really bog and tie an enemy down, especially if they don't want to launch like a massive meat wave style assault at you, which the Russians have resisted doing. And so it took well over a year to liberate this really important city in the Donbass. But Russia did it right in the lead up to these discussions, where one of the main sticking points at this time between the Russians and the Ukrainians is on the future of the Donbass, where of course, Ukraine is saying now they're not going to cede any territory, that they're going to take back the Donbass, they're going to expel the Russians even from the southern Ukrainian republics of Kherson and Zaporizhia. How they've even talked about the Crimean Peninsula, which of course is absolutely absurd. But I think, again, a more reasonable argument for the Ukrainians to make that somewhat resonates with people is that Russia is demanding 20% of the Donbass that they don't control, which now is really not true. It's far less than 20%, but the territory that Russia doesn't control isn't going to be easily held by the Ukrainians anyways. And so I think with Russia's victory in the Donbass, it's taking a major sticking point off the table, because now the Russian position has become the status quo, that Russia controls the Donbass. And when Ukraine is saying that we're not willing to cede the Donbass to Russia, well, it's already been captured and conquered. You don't possess the military strength to get it back. You don't have the weapons, the men, and at no time on the horizon in the future will that be the case. And so if Russia is willing to end the war based on the status quo territorially, that should be a far easier pill to swallow, not only for the Ukrainians, but to kind of convince Donald Trump that he needs to force the Ukrainians to swallow that pill, which I think is a really important part of all this. So the talks between Putin and Witkoff happened on Tuesday in Moscow. Both sides afterwards gave good reviews of the talks, which is kind of just standard practice. Even if I think not a lot of progress is made, they always say they're constructive, progress was made, we discussed these key issues. They did say that they didn't come to a compromise on the territory issue. And so again, I think this is an unwillingness of the American and the Ukrainian side to really recognize the reality of the situation, not only in the Donbass, but as that Russian general was saying, along the front lines, right? It's not very much territory that Russia is taking every day in Kherson, in Zaporizhia, in Sumy in the north, in Kharkiv in the north, but they are taking a village or two every single day along the front lines. And this war is now almost 4 years old. And so if you look at the Russian slow advances over the past year, you're taking one or two villages a day every day of the year. Well, then you're looking at hundreds of villages, and you're no longer talking about a few square kilometers. You're talking about tens, hundreds of kilometers of territory that has been taken by the Russians. And so this is creating a situation where if the Ukrainians agree to the status quo territorially, then they're meeting the Russian demands. And so it should make this deal far easier to get through. That being said, it seems like there's still a lot of other outstanding issues here in getting the deal done, particularly the security guarantees for Ukraine. This is one place where I do think Donald Trump probably needs to tell the Russians, like behind the scenes, like, hey, we're going to give the Ukrainians a security guarantee, but it's going to be vague enough that we're not actually agreeing to anything. And so that's as good as not having an agreement at all. I think it just can't resemble NATO Article 5 NATO guarantee. And Trump needs to tell Putin, like, look, hey, I got to get the Europeans on board. I got to convince the Ukrainians to accept this, or else they're going to keep fighting. So you need to agree to this meaningless guarantee, which hopefully the Russians will be on board with. Another major issue, and that actually gets me into another story here I want to tackle, that is with Trump's deal, it's calling for $100 million in frozen Russian European funds to go towards rebuilding Ukraine. And while I've heard a lot of people who are, not pro-Russian, but definitely pro-ending this war, saying that this should be a non-starter in the talks, I actually think this is may be a good thing. Donald Trump, I think, could go to Vladimir Putin and say, we're taking $100 million, and Donald Trump is going to frame it as a business deal. But hey, you got a lot of land. You're paying for the land. You got 4 Ukrainian oblasts and you paid $25 billion each for them. That's a pretty good deal. So you should just, take that deal. Maybe Russia will get some business interest in some of the funds. But one of the reasons that I think this might be a better move is that over the years, Russia has responded to having their assets and frozen and stolen by Western governments, is to freeze and steal some Western assets in Ukraine, or in Russia, excuse me. And so this has now created a dynamic where if Russia expects to get their frozen assets back, the Europeans are going to expect to get theirs back as well. Some of these things have been sold and values are going to be hard to come by. And all the people in the negotiations are complete pricks. And so they're all going to be willing to hold up peace in Ukraine over a few $billion here or there on the volume in a different businesses and assets that each side has frozen and sold off, or different things have been done with it. And so I do think that this is maybe a less complicated way to end the war, especially if Trump will say to Putin that, we're going to take that $100 billion, we're going to use it to rebuild Ukraine, but then we're not going to demand back some of the European assets that Russia has taken and seized, the government has seized. And again, this could be, I think, a fairly good compromise. Now, the Europeans are looking to screw this up right now, because one of the things that they're trying to do is they're trying to find a way to get a loan for Ukraine that uses the frozen Russian assets as collateral. And of course, nobody expects that Ukraine, if they get a $150 billion loan for the Europeans, are ever going to pay this back, right? It's certainly not in this century. And so they're effectively just taking the frozen Russian assets and they're giving that money to Ukraine. Now, the problem that the European Union is having is that the 27 nation bloc has to act in consensus, and Hungary is a member of that bloc. And so they've had to go through all kinds of legal loopholes to finally come up with a plan where they could circumvent the Hungarians. The bigger problem they now have is that almost all the funds, I think about 200 billion, are held in Belgian banks. And Brussels doesn't want to go along with this either. And one of the points that the Belgian foreign minister made was that if we leverage the frozen Russian assets to send a loan to Ukraine, then how does that work when those frozen assets are going to one day be used to rebuild Ukraine, right? You can't do both. You have to pick one or the other. And if they move forward with this loan, it's effectively going to tie up the Russian funds and make them unavailable to use for any war reparations for the Ukrainians. And I think that's a really good and really important point. Now, maybe in a little bit of good news here, it doesn't look like the loan's going to go through, that the Belgians are going to remain steadfast in their opposition, and that the Hungarians aren't going to go along with it. There's a couple other countries that are really questioning this. Europe does a lot of business with China, India, other countries, and those countries have assets held in European banks. And those European banks understand that if they steal the Russian money in total, this is going to make the Chinese, the Indians, the Brazilians, all these countries that exist outside of the, America-NATO alliance, right? They're going to be very hesitant about storing their money in European banks, because if they do something that those European governments, that the American government doesn't like, we're going to seize their assets. I mean, this is a lesson that Venezuela's learned, right? Where I think a lot of their maybe gold is held in the Bank of London or England, one or the other. And that money has been used by Western governments now to give to Venezuelan opposition members like Juan Guaido, where, him and his little cartel of leadership that tried to overthrow the government stole a lot of that money, but they're effectively using Venezuela's own assets as funding to conduct a regime change against the Venezuelan government. And they take the Russian money held in Europe and give it to Ukraine, you're going to see a very similar thing and dynamic. And so there are countries that are very concerned that they're going to lose a lot of the, Asian assets that they hold in their banks if they move forward with this. And so it doesn't look like it's going to happen. But if it doesn't happen, this creates a whole nother scenario where Ukraine needs $60 billion in military aid next year. And the Europeans have put, like, I think, 6, 7, 8 billion dollars in the NATO Plural Fund, which is basically the European Union's fund to buy American weapons for Ukraine. And so that's nowhere near the amount of money that the Ukrainians are going to need. And what happens when there's a massive budget shortfall, when Ukraine no longer has money to buy weapons, when the Europeans are unwilling to give the Ukrainians, buy more American weapons for the Ukrainians, what happens in Kyiv? Does the army collapse? Because if that's the case, this is really hurting Ukraine's negotiating position. And that's something that the Washington Post pointed out, that by the Europeans trying and failing to get this deal done, they've really created a problem for the Ukrainians. All right, before we wrap up here today, I do want to mention some updates on what's happening in Gaza. First of all, this post from this is the coordination center with the Israeli government. They kind of post about what the Israeli policy is in Gaza. If Palestinians have to evacuate from a new area, this Israeli agency will post about it, and they say that in coordination with the ceasefire agreement, we've agreed to reopen the Gaza border crossing with Egypt. This is Gaza's sole border crossing with Egypt, another country that isn't Israel. And this is great because then more aid and commerce could get into Gaza with this border crossing open. But the Israelis had a little surprise waiting for everybody. They're not opening it for anything coming into Gaza, only things going out of Gaza, only people going out of Gaza. And so this is, I think, a major signal that Israel has no intention of allowing the ceasefire to go through, no intention of allowing Gaza to be rebuilt, and full intention of conducting an ethnic cleansing in Gaza, where they're going to start allowing the people to leave, go into Egypt, where maybe they'll find a third country for them to go to or not. Now, one last update on all of this. This is an article that I'm going to have out at the Libertarian Institute this afternoon for everyone, if you want to check it out. Benjamin Netanyahu and his Likud party actually boycotted the vote in the Israeli Knesset to endorse Trump's 20-point peace plan for Gaza. And so Netanyahu was effectively trying to silently kill Trump's peace plan for Gaza. And that's really every sign that you need to understand that in Gaza, we don't have a meaningful ceasefire coming up. This isn't meant to be a permanent thing, a permanent end to the conflict, something that's going to lead to the rebuilding of Gaza for Palestinians, but rather the Israelis fully intend to break and squash this agreement and finish their genocide in the Strip coming in the coming months. All right, that's where I'm going to wrap it up. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in today. Be sure to share, subscribe to the show. It really helps us out here. We are a growing channel, and channels only grow with the support of their audience. You can always just give a thumbs up, a repost on X, wherever you're listening to the show, and we'll be back with another episode tomorrow.